I'm going to flick through a mainly visual presentation on regenerative agriculture. Some case set examples I was asked to present. But if you could bear in mind what Amanda's just spoken about, Walter, Phil, what Di's going to speak about, and our other speakers, it's all interrelated. So the implications of once we regenerate landscape functions, and those plants are accessing via the biology a lot more nutrients, and if your animals are grazing both grass and shrubs with a lot more phytonutrients, you're getting all sorts of stuff coming into the food, relates to this whole food story that we're talking about. So as I mentioned earlier today, a simple message about regenerative agriculture. We get healthy landscapes, extrapolates healthy food, fibre and communities, and right through to a healthy planet. Thanks, mate. That's my underground insurgency. Through healthy food and fibre off these landscapes, we partner with farmers, partner with urban communities, and create this agriculture of health. For myself, what's led to, what was really part of the book I wrote was, as a young farmer, I had to take over a farm at 22, inducted into an industrial paradigm. I made all the mistakes you can make in farming. I'm an expert on making mistakes. And when I reflected on that, I realised it was because I didn't understand how landscapes function. If you like, that landscape on the right there should have been in hospital in intensive care and needed healing. I couldn't read that. I was dyslexic. So out of that, looking at all, when I went back to university doing a PhD later in life, there's lots of cycles in nature, chemical, physical, Walter's a walking encyclopedia and all that. But you can simplify it down to those 5. Solar, flick through if you want. The solar, soil, mineral, water, biodiversity. Actually, go back one, please. And as one farmer said, this square foot of real estate up here, the paradigms we carry into our management, they're all interrelated. You harm one of those functions, you can see by those arrows it's going to harm all the others. Vice versa, you start regenerating it, get your solar panels up, more sugars into the soil, etc., everything benefits. Thanks. So I won't dwell on this too much, but I see my role as a manager of a landscape stacking on as many mini solar panels as I can to grab the carbon dioxide, turn it into sugar, feed the soil bugs, which can then lay down not long-living carbon through globulin and those sorts of things, or get the nutrients through what Walter was talking about, the mycorrhizal fungi out hunting those 25,000 kilometres of hyphae, bringing it back to a plant. Thanks. Just some quick examples, if you can see it, of how dramatic this can be. This is up near Bowen. That red arrow in those 2 photos is the same tree in that landscape as a benchmark. 100 years of being belted, overgrazing, that land was rock hard. You can imagine the big rain in the subtropics would all pour off. Once they got holistic grazing, got more solar panels on with ground cover, stuff that Phil was talking about, in 10 years you can see the dramatic difference bottom right. And that gully on the left, when they started, was steep-sided, actively eroding. The battens are now 45 degrees. And Moulon, who gave me these photos, back left please mate, that gully now is covered in eucalypt seedlings about that height. It's just keeping on rolling through this self-organising function. When you get all your landscape functions going, Mother Nature gets wound up and really gets going. Thanks. Just quickly, this is in the Fitzroy Basin, just up from Rockhampton. Same story, this time 150 years of bad burning and grazing, rock-hard land, lose all your waters. Switch over to retaining your ground cover and getting more diversity, C3, C4 grasses through the seasons. You can see the dramatic top and bottom, and that's 7 years on bottom right in a wet season. It is extraordinarily dramatic, getting those solar panels for much longer in the year, pumping the carbon in. I visited this guy in South Africa, that fence line, that's his neighbour on the right in desert country, after 400 years of Dutch and English mismanagement. That's his country on the left. When he started over 3 decades ago, all his country was desert. Then he started to get the solar energy going with ground cover, and you can see that result today. He's now more than tripled his production. and all those functions. You can see how soft the soil is and the diversity, etc. This is exciting stuff, just by switching your mindset. Thanks. And up in the Kimberleys, the Engler family didn't have the money to buy freeholds. They went up and got cheap lease country, which had been belted by feral donkeys and cattle, top right. And as he said, all we had, because there's no roads in, you've got to fly in, there's no resources much. All we had was ingenuity, solar electric fence, and animal impact. The bottom right is the result of shifting that whole regime, getting rid of the federals, and then starting to rotationally graze property. Thanks. And I won't go into the detail here, but some of the leaders in some of the different cropping, whether it's pasture or no-kill, it's all about keeping those green solar panels going for longer of the year. In this case, drilling in the autumn into your C4 summer grasses when they're going dormant, using animals to biologically stimulate the soil. And top left, as you start to harvest, 3-tonne oat crop in that case, your green feed for the summer's coming through. More solar panels on for longer of the year. Thanks. And that extrapolates to the water cycle. You've got more carbon in the soil. There's so many photos I've seen like this. On the left side, you get a big rain event, over 3 inches, and for us old fellas, in 2 hours. No runoff. On the right, lost half that rain, and there's more dramatic results. All because of getting deeper roots, more ground cover, more absorbency, more carbon. Thanks. And just briefly, Walter and I have had good talks over the last 36 hours of travel. What's not talked about in this country is how we've destroyed the small water cycle. We have dehydrated the country, and the Noongar people and Aboriginals I work with at home, their collective memory of a rehydrated, wet, lot of mists and fogs, no incised gullies, we've totally transformed that. And that's where the transpiration comes from, and the seeding with the micro-elements for rain and all that sort of stuff. Thanks. And just quickly, that green, what's called the Fertile Crescent, was where Western agriculture evolved in the Middle East, Syria, Libya, Saharan, Sub-Saharan. Beautiful country, 10,000 years ago when it evolved. Today it's all desert. And hence social crisis, as was mentioned. I will argue strongly what we've done to the small water cycle, and with millions of hectares in Western Australia baking in the summer heat and overgrazed country, we have started to shift our landscapes down the path of desertification. No one wants to confront it, but that's what's happening. Thanks. And with the water cycle, when you get it going, this is in Mexico, 27 years. Blue arrow is the same point in that landscape. You can see why the water ran off on the left side. 27 years later on the right, no water, 10,000 more times in ground. Thanks. And we haven't got time, but this is an innovative guy not far from where Peter Andrews works. Had neighbours upstream flogging country. He said, I've got 4,000 acres of free water collection. How can I hold that in ground? And he's got extraordinary designs. Thanks, mate. Where he now stores millions of gallons, and a creek, instead of running, say, 3 days a year after a big event, now trickles all year, and his neighbours and he benefits. Some really exciting stuff going on. Thanks. And what Phil and Walter can talk about all day, I sat through 2 soil courses, nearly 40 years apart. I mainly heard physics and chemistry. Didn't hear much about biology, but we all know, I think, from today, what the big secret is. You know, mycorrhizal fungi, and the bedding down of long-term carbon, and that's the key, a biologically active living soil. Thanks. And just quickly to follow up Phil's work, you've probably heard of Gabe Brown, a wonderful innovator in the top end of the prairies in the States, using cover cropping, multi-species and holistic grazing. 30 metres away is a neighbour, traditionally cropping chemical and stuff. On the bottom of that soil is Gabe Brown's soil. You can see earthworms. We've just heard about structure and all the rest of it. On the top is his neighbour's soil. If you walk around with a penetrometer, Gabe's, it'll go straight in, probably 200 psi. I'd be scared of breaking the penetrometer in the neighbours. It's probably 1,000 psi. Thanks. Just quickly, get your soil biology and all the rest of it going, add just 1% more carbon to your soil, the evidence will show that soil becomes capable of storing over 140,000 extra litres of water per hectare. Carbon is the magic thing. That's why Soils for Life has its name. Thanks. And the Haggertys here, a wonderful example of integrating animal grazing with biological cropping, and I'll leave Di to talk about that later. Thanks. And just finally, of those 4 biophysical ones, the role of biodiversity is crucial. Insect control, diversity, ground cover. Walter can go on all day about the density of trees to trap the mists and the fogs and all that sort of stuff. Thanks. Just to give you a quick example, these are some wonderful innovators in Otway Ranges, Western Melbourne. The Stewart family, that, by the way, that strain of posts is the same marker in each photo. So top left, 94, they got down to 2% veg, salt erosion. Now got up to 20%, so they've taken 18% of land out. This is a common story with Ron Watkins, just up the road. 18% out, but their production's gone up. But more than that, that vegetation they've got, they've now been able to stack in 6 or 7 more enterprises. So their social resilience has gone up. Various harvesting properties from the timber, bush tucker, bees, the whole sort of box of dice. And this is one of them. That farm dam was badly salted and eroding. So they whacked a fence around about 4 acres, planted beautiful flowers, cut flowers. That's now a major enterprise that his wife's got going into elite restaurants on the Surf Coast. Thanks. I think we'll keep skipping some of these other agroforestry ones. And again, thanks, mate. And of course, talking about food, you've got your wonderful food forest landscapes of the Iberian Peninsula, whether it's the Spanish Dehesa or the Portuguese Montado. Cork oak forests with 6 or 7 different enterprises scattered through, including the acorns feeding the world's most famous ham, the yamal. And so finally, which we needn't dwell on, but it's the square foot of real estate. It's the paradigms we carry to our landscape that dramatically affects how we manage, and I'm arguing if we all got some ecological literacy, which isn't taught, the paradigm shift will come. Thanks. And without going into it, one of the great things of going back to university after about 40 years was learning about complex adaptive systems and wonderful concepts like the capacity of natural systems to self-organise when we step back and enable them to get on with what they've been good at for millions of years. And that's really at the guts of regenerative agriculture. Us stepping back, creating the conditions for self-organisation to occur, as I've just shown in the previous photos. Just quickly, I've begun working with Paul Hawken, who got sick of climate scientists not being able to answer what do we do about it. So 15 years ago, he got 40 top thinkers and analysts to look at the 100 best methods of drawing down carbon. When I went through it, this is published last year, a lot of numbers behind it. When you analyse the top 80 with all the big numbers on them, there's 6 or 7 regen ag methods. And I said to him, put them together because they're all doing the one thing. The same thing. If you do that, regenerative agriculture is #1 by nearly 2.5 times the next best method. So we want to address climate change or the Anthropocene boundary challenges. Regenerative ag is the great pathway. And to me, that's incredibly exciting and empowering. Thanks. And just finally, we're getting some numbers now in Australia through university studies. This couple just out of Canberra regenerated their country. Retimbered ridges where a lot of recharge for Australian underground water occurs, it usually overclear. And in 30 years, they've taken their soil carbon from 1 to 4% and sequestered more carbon than 11 times the total farm emissions. Thanks. So I'll finish with Hippocrates' wonderful statement nearly 2,500 years ago. Some of you will be familiar with this. This is the guy that gave the medical fraternity their Hippocratic oath. Let food be thy medicine and medicine be thy food. And we just heard Amanda go on in great fashion about the implications of that. So I'll leave it there.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks to Ev Collins for organising the Food for Thought Festival and bringing together all these people from really diverse backgrounds. It really is what enables things to happen for making things better, all of us working together. Just a bit of my background. My husband and I took on our farm in 1994. It wasn't an inherited farm. And that one? Basically, as a person myself, I'm a wife, a mother of three, a livestock manager on our farm. I run all the livestock, and a farmer as well, because while I'm checking all the sheep, I'm also checking the crop health at the same time. In a previous life, I studied occupational therapy and worked in preventative healthcare with paediatrics, but also chronic aged care. So I saw both ends of the spectrum, which really probably stimulated an awareness and understanding of the importance of preventative health. Our farms in the Central Wheat Belt, we've got about 13,000 hectares, mainly cereal grains and sheep. Initially started farming conventional best practice, that's all we knew to start with. All looked pretty good on the surface. Yeah, some pretty good seasons in the 90s, so fairly productive outcomes. But it was getting to the stage where every time we did a soil test, the recommendations were coming back that you need to put more of this on, more of that on. It was when the fungal outbreaks started to happen, lots of rust problems throughout the wheat belt, and you're starting having to put fungicides on and with livestock needing to put, drenching animals for parasites more frequently and dealing with all sorts of other things. It's just seemed to be a case of having to do more and more for less and less potential profit at the end of the day, and a lot more work. So we started to think about this a fair bit. There was a lot of soil amelioration things that were starting to become an issue, once again costing more and more money. So yeah, we're starting to look at what some of the potential answers around that might be. So we started to look on working on our own knowledge base, so just real gluttons for punishment, trying to learn as much as we possibly could. And we were fortunate enough to go to a function in Perth in 2001 where Dr. Elaine Ingham and Dr. Arden Anderson both presented for a 4-day course. Gave us a wonderful understanding about the links between soil health and human health from Arden Anderson, and Elaine Ingham talking about how the microbiological process within the soil can actually have some outstanding outcomes for not only the function of your own farming property, but the food produce and so forth that you can create from that. We also at the same time worked with Jane Slattery from South Australia, who had a free choice mineral system business at that stage, and she taught me a heck of a lot about integration of livestock into landscape and their capacity to intuitively repair land, so being able to move nutrients from high areas of high nutrient to low nutrient, if we enabled them to do so. And then at a local level with Dr. Christine Jones, we're very fortunate in 2008 to meet Christine and get some awareness of her liquid carbon pathway system that she described, which has been a real breakthrough for understanding what's going on. And Christine also reinforced a lot of the stuff that Arden Anderson talked about, with saying that a lot of our food's lacking the natural or necessary vitamins and minerals and so forth because of the lack of biological activity in the soil. So at the end of the day, a lot of these things are present, but the plants aren't able to access them because, as Walter talked about, we've created a system where we're using a straw to uptake nutrients out of solution, as opposed to the microbial system, which has the innate intelligence to select appropriate nutrients in the right ratios, to source them further afield if required with the fungal hyphae, and create a far greater nutrient profile in the plants that we grow through that process. And at the end of the day, what I'm talking about today is a transitional process, moving away from, I guess, what came post-World War II, as Walter talks about, and trying to, while still using modern agriculture with the same machinery and but getting back to enabling that natural process to occur that happened before the advent of chemical fertilisers and some of the technologies we're using today. And I guess part of the problem with that has been the pursuit of creating cheap food and it becoming a commodity, as Charlie was mentioning. It's created lots of issues because at the end of the day it's driven down food production systems be the lowest cost denominator, which unfortunately isn't really eventuating because a lot of the food production systems now are becoming increasingly high in costs, but we're getting a poorer and poorer outcome as a result of it, and as many people have talked about today, those disease systems coming forward. So we just got to go back to that whole recognition of our food being an integral part of our life instead of just something that we need to get that's cheap. And we've also, a few people have already looked at the salinity issue and the state of decline throughout the agricultural regions, and it's already been touched on with Western Australia in particular, the loss of the large and small water cycles out there in our agricultural regions. You can understand why we're having trouble with dealing with lower rainfall events or erratic rainfall events when you look at a landscape like the one on top. But as Charlie's also mentioned, that agriculture, whilst it can be a contributor to some of that problem in the first picture, it can also be part of the solution if we become more restorative in our paradigm. So back to basics is just restoring those ecosystems with plants and animals. I guess we've termed it natural intelligence agriculture because at the end of the day, when you step back and look at it, the key parts of it is that it's not necessarily human driven. Nature had it all sorted, as Walter will tell us many times, that those natural processes have been there way before we started to intervene and tried to call it agriculture. So we're just trying to step back and allow those things to occur. So enabling that microbial intelligence to occur, those relationships between the soil microbes and the plant roots as they emerge, the animal intelligence in their grazing patterns, and of course it's all powered by photosynthesis. One of the first things we've done other than utilising the animals is getting off the synthetic chemical bandwagon. We stopped using a lot of synthetic fertilisers in 2008, and the last couple of years we've totally removed the use of nitrogen as well. We replaced the granular fertilisers in 2008 with a worm liquid and using compost extract. The key part of that, I guess, is like with anything, it's the quality of the worm liquid or the compost that you're using that has the big impact. So like with anything, like with food, there can be high quality foods or poor quality, and you've got to source the absolute best. So stuff that actually has a lot of those micronutrients available, then once you put them into the soil, they are, I guess they do facilitate the restoration of the indigenous microbes to rebuild with a lot of the secondary metabolites and so forth that have been spoken about that are actually in those products after a compost process or a worm digestion process, which we probably don't necessarily know all the fine detail, but once they get into a soil environment, they trigger those reactions within the soil. So part of that, I guess, too, is building that microbiome or rhizosheath around the plant roots as it emerge. Our seed on the right-hand side there is thoroughly coated with a good rhizosheath. And the neighbour's one there, he actually hasn't used a seed dressing, which is unusual. Most people do use a insecticide or fungicidal seed dressing. So if that had have been treated with one of those products, you would have had even less soil and rhizosheath development than what he's got there. But you can see, even though the seed on the far side hasn't yet reached the surface to start photosynthesising, it's already directed a lot of energy and effort into signalling to the plant, to the soil microbes that this is what we need. I need some protection from whatever toxins might be in the soil, but also the capacity then to start accessing nutrients. That process is happening from a very early stage. And courtesy of Phil, we've been very blessed to have Phil take lots of photos of stuff happening under the microscope so we can see what that rhizosheath looks like. Close up with seeing some of the fungal activity in the soil aggregation and building air spaces around roots and in the soil and all the rest of it to enable these things to happen. And I really love this one. Seeing a lovely big airspace there, so you think there where water can capture and be held in that soil over a wider landscape. This picture closest to me, oops, I'm moving away from my square. is a farm that we took on 4 years ago. That was only the second year of actually working with that land, but we treated the seed with a biological seed dressing and put the worm liquid and the compost extract as we seed. It puts it in a liquid behind the seed, so it's immediately there available for the plants as they grow. But really showing some really good root development and penetration, because that soil there, the top pH, surface pH is about 4.5, but when you get to where those roots are, it's 4, and it was getting around about 3.8 as you got down deeper. But you can see clearly how compacted that soil is. But those roots were actually right to the bottom of that hole. Anyway, we should have dug deeper and seen how much further down they went, but it was really interesting. There'd been no lime applied or anything like that, but just that rhizosheath protection capacity enabled those roots to push right through that pH and high aluminium soil, which you wouldn't expect. Normally you'd expect J-curves and the roots to burn off and so forth, but they didn't. So it really gives you a good indicator of how the plants can heal that soil and over a fairly short period of time. The ones on the far side was a wheat plant and a radish plant, which were dug up on the same shovel full of soil. Once again, it was only the second year of dealing with that paddock, but you can see clearly which plant's actually outperforming the other one as far as occupying soil space, accessing nutrient, accessing water. And we do find that plants like radishes just become less and less prolific, less and less vigour, whereas the wheat plants, you know, or the cropping plants that we're trying to grow, they're the ones that we're going to make the money off, are actually winning the war. The animal side of things is probably my biggest passion, but really excited when you see sheep manure covered in fungi. You know that something's going right there. Part of achieving that, we think, is when we, there's a few things we've had to do with the livestock. Firstly, we've got them off any grain supplements, and we also stopped drenching them, so stopped interfering with the microbiome within their rumen. So that what was coming out the back end was full of live microbes and not heavily weighted towards ones that enjoyed an acidic environment. So we wanted ones that were going to be happier in a healthier soil environment and contribute to that. I'll go into the self-replacing part of it a bit, but also that whole pasture-fed system, and Charles has talked about having the browse as well as the grasses, and really trying to reintegrate diversity of fodder shrubs and so forth, not only to help drought-proof the farms by having plants that are growing no matter what the season might be, but that diversity of nutrient for the animals, so that supports their health and supports the microbiome in their gut, because the animals intuitively know what they need to browse and graze to support their right gut health, but if we haven't got that available to them, then they can't do that job. So lots of different outcomes from a non-farmer to a local level and a global level, but starting off with rebuilding the sponge, and Phil touched on that in his talk, but that's the same second year paddock steam. You can see some air spaces in that root mass there, a lot of soil held and a lot of surface and volume of soil taken up by that plant. We had some deep soil testing done in 2012, which was really interesting, and they looked at carbon changes between the same soil type on neighbouring properties, so the neighbours to ours, and they found that we had higher carbon levels, but interestingly also higher soil nitrogen levels and a higher water holding capacity. Now the higher carbon levels was really interesting because at 2012 it was following virtually a decade of very, very dry years through our area. So the capacity to build labile carbon from plant residue and organic matter and stuff, you know, from the top down wasn't going to cut the mustard. This was all through liquid carbon pathway that Christine Jones talks about. And interestingly, the further down they went, the greater the discrepancy was between our farm and the neighbour's farm. But also the neighbour had a legume phase in their previous 2 years before these soil tests had done, and ours was a continuous cereal program prior to the testing being done, yet we had higher nitrogen levels in the soil. We can just put that down to the nitrifying bacteria and that whole process of the soil aggregates and enabling that nitrogen to be occurring even under cereal crops. So that's why we can get away with not having to put nitrogen on the crops, and this one was a crop we've grown this year with no NPK, no fungicides, no pesticides, just with the worm liquid and a compost extract, and a very resilient, healthy crop. Changing soil ecology by taking away all the artificial fertilisers. We've then seen quite a dramatic change in soil ecology and the type of plants that prefer to grow there. So some of the problem summer weeds like caltrop or melons and so forth, which you probably often have to deal with because of the fact that they impede your seeding process, those plants they just stop germinating, and we've found now that summer grasses come back in preference. So that was 2013, there was a wet harvest, side-by-side paddocks. We had all the summer grasses come up, and the neighbours directly next door just had radish and melons, and they had to go and spray those. Just this summer just gone, 2017 was a really nasty drought up our way, but we had some rain in January, and this paddock we'd only worked for 2 years prior, but just instantly with the change in that soil ecology where the air seeder had gone through, with the summer rain, all the Paspaldium came up with what we'd seeded. It was just phenomenal, and we had that over about 4,500 acres of land, and it was just phenomenal to see that, and provided some wonderful sheep feed for us when we really needed it after a nasty year. Things that we're seeing too around the farm is just the restoration of the biodiversity and the different plants. There's one paddock, I wish I'd have before photo of it here with me, but when we first went there, I only had about 6 different plants in the actual pasture paddock, and I drove over it the other day moving a mob of sheep, and I picked 35 just as I was going past, and a lot of those were wildflowers and things like that, which is really fantastic to see in the agricultural lands. Another thing is having less fossil fuel usage and more time, so getting off the boom sprays, which is a really critical factor by not having to deal with those problems. Once you get that immune system function back into the plants and the animals, there's less work required because there's less disease expression, and if there is a bit of disease expression in the plants, the immune system does kick in, and it doesn't seem to be such a big issue, so you can get away with it a lot better. The animal health and welfare, so you're not having to intervene with the animals all the time with drenching, and we don't have mules. Those young ewe hoggets there, 15-month-old, born in a drought, had no drenching, and yet they've grown beautifully, and lovely clean faces, clean noses, very healthy animals. Salt land potentials. With that summer rain we had in January, just seeing some of those summer grasses coming up on the salt-affected land. Good opportunity there for helping to restore some of those saline lands, and also the whole microbial interface, preventing the salt getting into the plants by that rhizosheath development, and enabling some of these plants to grow better and more for longer periods on this salt-affected land. And to the point where the crop that we've got growing on a new farm this year, with the dry, we haven't had much rain on there until this last week. From the beginning of August, it was a thumping crop, and it's still maintained that it hasn't had any moisture deficiency effects, and we think it must have something to do with that capacity to access some of that water underneath the surface, because it is highly salty land with lots of salt lakes and a high water table. It must be accessing some of that other than what's coming from the sky. Lots of wildflowers coming back, which is a wonderful thing for people to say when you're talking about mental health. There's not only just the beauty of the landscape returning, but also then there's the studies into seeing increased serotonin levels with exposure to actinomycetes and other soil-borne organisms. We'll go on for a while, but at the end of the day, the key factor we're looking at is producing premium food, so food that's lower in nitrates, and I'm getting the wrap up. But we have had our grains all tested with 3 laboratories throughout Australia, and being able to demonstrate that there's totally free of fungicides, pesticides, mycotoxins, heavy metals, and glyphosate and all those things. So that's purely a reflection of that microbial system functioning appropriately, preventing those toxins into the plant. And this can be even from a year 1 farm. Once that rhizosheath's there intact and functioning, some wonderful things can happen. And It is very much a transitional story. We're seeing more and more every year. It gets very exciting. You just wonder how much more you can really take on board, but you just jump on for the ride, and it's I guess it's unlimited potential, I think, to the future. Anyway, I better leave it there.